Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Pryor, the director of the Institute of Politics, and in behalf of the Kennedy School of Government and the Institute, we welcome each of you tonight. This is a wonderful evening. We have a wonderful crowd here to come to hear the junior senator from Massachusetts. And if I may, in the Senate, we used to say, Mr. President, I want to rise on a matter of personal privilege. First, I would take the personal privilege to introduce the Senator's wonderful wife, Teresa Hines. Teresa, we're so honored you are here. Thank you. We go back a long time. Thank you, Teresa. I knew John Kerry for a number of years. I had the pleasure of serving with him in the United States Senate. I first knew about John Kerry when he was a young prosecutor. I followed his career as he became the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. I knew of his courageous efforts in the Vietnam conflict. I knew of his eloquent voice after that conflict was beginning to subside. I watched John Kerry in the Senate for many a time and many an occasion, because many senators rise, they speak, and no one listens. John Kerry gets up to speak, and people listen. And it's good that people listen, because John Kerry is one of those unique individuals which is not only a role model, I think, for young Americans everywhere, but John Kerry is a role model today for politics, to make politics something better, to restore civility, to get things done, to be able to reach across the aisle, and to be able to accomplish things for our country and our world. John Kerry has just returned from Vietnam. He traveled there with the President on a most historic mission. Perhaps he may ask you, he may tell you about that. If he doesn't, you may want to ask him about it momentarily. To introduce my friend and your friend, and by the way, John, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to now be your constituent here in Massachusetts. It is a great opportunity for me. I'm going to register to vote. I certainly will. They might not let me vote in Arkansas if I voted here, though. Marcy Bianco is going to introduce Jeffrey Sachs, Professor Sachs, momentarily. Marcy spent a lot of time in New Hampshire. She is known as a grassroots political organizer. And for that reason, she has been elected president of the Harvard Young Democrats. And because of that, we're allowing her tonight to do a major portion of our introduction. Marcy, thank you. Thank you, Marcy.
Thank you, Senator Pryor. My name is Marcy Bianco, and I'm the president of the Harvard College Democrats. Many of us in Massachusetts know Senator Kerry as a Vietnam veteran, as the Democratic leader on the Senate Banking and Small Business Committee, and as a champion of environmental issues. But to students, Senator Kerry is a friend. Over the years, he's built a strong rapport with college students in Massachusetts, and especially here at Harvard. Speaking on behalf of college students, I know that Senator Kerry would always make time to spend with the college Democrats if we asked him to attend one of our events. As Massachusetts Students to Grow coordinator, I appreciated his willingness to travel weekend after weekend up to New Hampshire with the college students. I'm speaking for all college students when I say thank you, Senator Kerry, not only for fighting for democratic ideals in the Senate, but also for reminding students that our idealism is not unfounded, and that politicians genuinely care about us and our future. You are a true inspiration to the young and the old alike. Now I would like to turn the podium over to Jeffrey Sachs, the director of the Center for International Development here at the Kennedy School.
Thanks very much, Marcy, and for the nice words for everybody. We are extremely fortunate to have with us this evening our senator who in the last week, I understand, has been on the historic mission to Vietnam, has been to Cambodia pressing the human rights agenda, was at The Hague after that in the climate change negotiations, and but for us probably would be in Tallahassee tonight. So you owe us one for that, I think. We at least kept you close to home, and we're grateful that in the midst of all of this turmoil and confusion that you could find the time to show us the light this evening to help us understand what's happening in American politics and what's likely to happen in the coming years. John Kerry is serving his third term now as as senator from Massachusetts, and he has played an incredible leadership role on a very wide range of issues. In foreign policy, in leadership on human rights, in our national security, in reform of public education, in healthcare, in concerns for the poor around the world. He has been one of the most important and clearest and principled voices in America. He's the ranking member of the Senate Small Business Committee. He serves on the Foreign Relations, Banking, Commerce, and Intelligence Committees, and heaven knows we need his intelligence, and we're lucky to have it. He serves also as in the Senate Democratic leadership as chairman of the Steering and Coordination Committee. He was first elected to public office as Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts in 1982, and then elected to the Senate in 1984. He was reelected in 1990, and then again in a very important contest in 1996, defeating, you'll remember, Governor William Weld of Massachusetts in a very important race, and we're grateful that you're here. He is a graduate of Yale University, and we're still grateful. He entered the Navy after graduation from college, became an officer on a gunboat in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, and received a Silver Star, Bronze Star, and 3 awards of the Purple Heart for his heroism in combat. Upon returning home from Vietnam, he became an active leader of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War and co-founder of Vietnam Veterans of America. He attended Boston College Law School, worked as a prosecutor of Middlesex County, and then, as I described, entered elective office. Last but certainly not least, we're thrilled with this dynamic duo that we have with us to have Senator Kerry's wife, Teresa Hines, not just with us, but with us so solidly at Harvard as a great benefactor of the university and a great intellectual guide, as well as a member, key member of our International Advisory Board of the Center for International Development. So we are thrilled that you're here, Senator. We're thrilled that you're both here, and please tell us what's going on.
Jeffrey, thank you very, very much for a generous introduction. I am really honored to be here. This is one of the great platforms in the United States of America, and I have watched sometimes at home as this forum has provided insight. I don't know if I'll be up to those standards tonight, but it is a privilege for me to be here and be part of it. And the truth is, you did save me from being in Tallahassee. So, I want you to know also, in the amount of time it took to finally get me up here, the lawyers have filed 30 new lawsuits down in Florida. It's a great privilege to be here with experts in our government, so many of you like Marcy, who aspire one day to high positions. No doubt someday one of you may grow up to have the most important position in this land, Secretary of State of Florida. Someone actually told me I wasn't your first choice to speak tonight, but I won the recount, folks. Those of us from Massachusetts are kind of upset at what's going on in Florida, because we're used to the clean politics of Boston and Worcester and other such places. Come to think of it, if there'd been a recount in 1960, I might be speaking in Yorba Linda at the Richard Nixon School of Government. I don't know. So I can't tell you how happy I am that I'm not. Now, I know a lot of you students, I do, as Marcy says, spend a lot of time with students, and I'm pleased to say that I've got a pretty good sense of what's going on. I know most of you are worrying about how you can get the most lucrative job possible to pay off your student loans. And in the last few days, it has occurred to me precisely what that is. After watching all of the press conferences, each of you should become an American flag salesman. You'll have it made. I would like to introduce, my wife has been introduced, but I want to sort of restate, Jeffrey was kind enough to say what a wonderful influence she has been on many different issues. She's a great environmentalist, a great leader on women's issues, particularly women's health, income security, and other issues. But born as she was in Mozambique and living for so many years in a dictatorship, she comes with a particular sense of what it means to lose property and to not be able to vote. And so she comes, I think, with a reaffirmation to all of you of the importance that we have just learned in these last days about that precious right that we have in this country. And I am blessed to have her as a partner as well as lover, wife, and I thank you for being here and being part of all of that. Thank you. Hooray. And finally, I want to introduce, I don't know where she is, but it's both good and bad. There she is. She comes, as I do, as a Yale graduate, boo, hiss, sorry, bad. But she is about to embark on a wonderful portion of her life, which is going to the Harvard Medical School. So I want to introduce my daughter, Vanessa, who is back here. I also want to share with you what a special privilege it is. And I know you hear this word from those of us in public life, and I do not want to abuse it. So let me try to give it the full measure of import that it deserves. But David Pryor is and was one of the gems of the United States Senate, and you are so lucky to have him here. He constantly exhibited a sense of conscience, a clear sense of purpose and direction, a wonderful sense of humor, a great colleague. We miss him enormously. He is your gain here, and following in the footsteps of Alan Simpson, you all are setting a rather remarkable tradition here of tapping into the best of the United States Senate. And David, it's a privilege to be here with you. Thank you. And I also salute what Jeffrey and the Center are doing. And I'll talk about that a little bit as I go through the evening. You know, I had sort of thought about what I wanted to say, and I really want to just talk to you, not a whole bunch of prepared comments. I want to kind of talk about frustrations, anxieties, hopes, aspirations, feelings that I have about where I find myself in the politics of our country at this difficult time, and also at this time of great opportunity. And I think it is that. What we will make of it remains yet to be written. And for all of us, this is a time of challenge and perhaps a reevaluation of the American political process and where we find ourselves. I know there'll be some questions about Florida, so I don't want to overdo it on Florida in my opening comments. But let me just share this with you. I have often marveled, as I'm sure David has, when we sit on those porticos, either east or west of the United States Capitol, that magnificent moment, celebrated only the way it is in the United States of America, when an individual raises, to this point, his hand, someday I am confident her hand, and takes the oath of office for the greatest transfer of power in a free society anywhere on the face of this planet. And what we always marvel, and we do comment on it. I remember sitting beside Bill Bradley and Joe Biden once and sort of turning and saying, look around you. There's not one military uniform. It is truly incredible when you measure the consequences of that act. And it's against that backdrop that I ask my fellow citizens to think hard about what is going on in Florida. I've noticed in the national press polls already trying to push the notion that there is something less than principle at stake here, that there is something less than the way we govern ourselves at stake, and that perhaps the Vice President of the United States is testing people's patience by asking that the votes in Florida be counted properly. Let me caution all of you and all of my fellow Americans to stand back for a moment and rest confident that on January 20th, one of these two people will, in the great tradition of this country, peacefully raise their hand and take the oath of office as President of the United States. And we won't miss a heartbeat in that process, providing we allow due process in the legal system of this country to work properly and to respect our own laws. Now that, I think, is paramount. I think mistakes have been made on both sides. I think partisanship, unfortunately, and not statesmanship, has been evident in the decisions made by both camps. But this is, after all, a hotly contested, heated process, and one can expect those kinds of sort of passionate errors of judgment in those moments. The fact is, however, that no one should condone the notion that we don't have time to make certain that the votes are properly tested and counted so that whoever is the next President of the United States comes to that office with the full measure of legitimacy that the office deserves and that the world demands. Just coming back, as I have, as Jeffrey mentioned, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from The Hague, I've sort of seen the world's newspapers and news shows for the course of a week and a half or so. And I didn't like what I felt and what I saw as other countries sort of questioned what's happening in Florida. Does the United States have its act together? Will we be able to pull this off or not? And so I want to share with you, I just got this tonight, hadn't read it myself completely, but let me read to you what the Supreme Court of the state of Florida itself said, which is at issue before the Supreme Court of the United States. 25 years ago, this court commented that the will of the people, not a hyper-technical reliance upon statutory provisions, should be our guiding principle in election cases here. The real parties in interest here, not in the legal sense, but in realistic terms, are the voters. They are possessed of the ultimate interest, and it is they whom we must give primary consideration. The contestants have direct interest, certainly, but the office they seek is one of high public service and of utmost importance to the people, thus subordinating their interest to that of the people. Ours is a government of, by, and for the people. Our federal and state constitutions guarantee the right of the people to take an active part in the process of that government, which for most of our citizens means participation via the election process. The right to vote is the right to participate. It is also the right to speak, but more importantly, the right to be heard. We must tread carefully on that right, or we risk the unnecessary and unjustified muting of the public voice. By refusing to recognize an otherwise valid exercise of the right of a citizen to vote for the sake of sacred, unyielding adherence to statutory scripture, we would in effect nullify that right. And so it is, at the end of the decision, the court said, because the right to vote is the preeminent right in the Declaration of Rights of the Florida Constitution, the circumstances under which the Secretary may exercise her authority to ignore a county's returns filed after the initial statutory date are limited. The Secretary may ignore such returns only if their occlusion will compromise the integrity of the electoral process in either of two ways. One, by precluding a candidate, elector, or taxpayer from contesting the certification of the election, which is precisely what Al Gore is doing, or two, by precluding Florida voters from participating fully in the electoral process. That does not occur until the 12th of December. So again, I would be very surprised if the Supreme Court of the United States doesn't find that the right of the Florida court to interpret between three conflicting statutes is not a very normal course of events for the courts of this country, and that therefore we have a right to count the votes. Now about that very quickly, because I said I don't want to spend all my time on it. In Miami-Dade County, they began a count according to this order, a hand count. They counted 22% of the ballots. And in that 22%, they determined, as is their right, that 157 votes went to Al Gore. They stopped counting. Some would say because of unruliness in the halls. I'm not going to make any argument about why. They stopped. And in stopping, they left out 78% of the votes, which if extrapolated according to the sample that they took would mean that Al Gore would have anywhere from 700 to 800 votes coming to him. In addition, in Palm Beach County, they counted 215 votes, at which point they refused to take the count, even though they finished an hour and a half later, and in the order had said that if her office wasn't open Sunday, she could take those votes on Monday morning. But for technicality, the kind of technicality the court said was not appropriate, they shut off those 215 votes. 51 votes were counted in Nassau County, but because they didn't get a total amount of count the same as their first count, it was slightly less, they nullified the votes that they actually had counted, the 51, and went back to the original certification number. So 51, 157, 215 means that the real margin that the Secretary of State might have chosen to certify was about 114, 130 or so votes. And then the question is, what happens to 10,750 votes that were run through machines? And all the Republicans are correct in saying we counted those votes, but they were counted by the machines that are faulty and don't count. So in effect, there has never been a hand count of those numbers of ballots. That, my friends, is the issue before the United States of America. Are we going to have a president who lost the popular vote, who had less electoral votes at the time of certification, for whom the Secretary of State who certifies is a campaign manager in the state of certification for the candidate for whom they certify, and we don't have the total votes counted? Now, I think that's a legitimate question. I'm not telling you what the outcome will be. I don't know what it will be. But no one can convince me that in this great country of ours, where people all over the world look to us for the integrity of our election process and our transfer of power, that we do not have the time and the patience not to be subject to the polls and the focus groups and the push that says we should terminate this before due process has been played out. Now, something obviously is wrong with our politics in this country. Did you vote for Ralph Nader? All right. I'm just making sure what kind of ice I'm standing on, folks. You know? I want to know how quickly this collapses beneath me. So I'm going to get to that. But let me just chat with you for a minute, because I share, you know, I've known Ralph Nader for years. I like to think that I cut my teeth on some of his politics, the public interest research groups. Many of us thought he should have run for president 25, 30 years ago. So I have great affinity for his perceptions about ways in which the system is broken. But at the same time, I have a different sense of perhaps how we might have fixed it this time and how we should fix it as we go down the road. And I want to talk about that just for a few minutes, and then really I want to try to encourage as many questions and as much dialogue as we can have. I have now watched this system as a participant, as David described, at many different levels. Just down the street, I was a prosecutor in one of the 10 largest counties in America. Been a lieutenant governor for a short span of time, was a private attorney practicing law for a period of time, and I've now had 16 years in the United States Senate. Years of enormous reward and great give and take, and years I wouldn't trade. And so I think I come to this now at a point where I understand and appreciate the cynicism that exists in this country and the sense of divorce of the American people from their representative institutions, most importantly from the Congress of the United States. And I share the frustration about that. I am the only member of the United States Senate who has been elected 3 times to the Senate without ever taking a dime of PAC money or special interest money or soft money. And I say that because I want you to understand, and particularly those of you who had a passion for where Ralph Nader was coming from, that some of us down there get it. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because in my judgment, this campaign, these past months, at almost every level, missed an opportunity to really touch on the aspirations and hopes and real concerns of most Americans in the way that I think most people want politics to touch them. It was absent history, absent poetry, absent a sense of the greater possibilities of life and of what campaigning and indeed government really ought to be about. And so I say to you that there are a whole set of issues that ought to concern us. I see Maurice Strong here, the international environment, major choices about fisheries that are depleted because too much money is chasing too few fish all around the world, major questions of deforestation, calamities of human condition from country to country, AIDS in Africa, the lack of capacity building and human infrastructure in country after country. Cambodia, where I just came back, where we're trying to institute a war crimes tribunal to have accountability and closure for a country of 6 million people that lost 2 million of them to a regime that killed every intellectual and everybody who stood for anything, and now is floundering, trying to find its way back into the community of nations. We're connected to all of these things. But here at home, there are a set of choices that we've ignored. And I want to just put one particular one in front of you and ask the simple question of why it is that wasn't more part of the dialogue and why it is that we can't do something about it. If you read the front page of the New York Times today, there was a story about what's happened because of our decline of crime in the United States, which is great because we all wanted it to go down. And I led the fight to put 100,000 police officers on the streets of America. And I'm proud of what we've done in the context of community policing and restoring order to communities that desperately needed it. But the consequences of that are that we have more than doubled the prison population of this country. If you were to imprison people today at the rate that we imprisoned people in 1980, we'd have put about 567,000 people into jail. Instead, we have 1.8 million people in jail. We've imprisoned them at a rate 3 times the rate at the height of the crime wave in 1980. And now suddenly, about 600,000 of them are prepared to come back to the streets of America. And yet, over these past years, because of the attitude of people in Washington, we've cut treatment, we've cut training, we've cut job training, we've cut ongoing education, and people are prepared to come back as angry and as bitter and as lost and as incapable of joining the mainstream of society as they were the day that they went to prison. At the same time as we've allowed that to happen, we've allowed our children in this country to increase the level at which they are at risk. Now, I'm not saying this to you for any trumped-up, dramatic reasons. This is real. Every 9 seconds in our country, a child drops out of school. 48% of the kids in New York City do not finish high school. Every 10 seconds, a child is reported neglected or abused. Every 15 seconds, a child is arrested. Every 36 seconds, a child is born low birth weight, malnutrition. Every minute and a half, a child I guess it's every hour and a half, a child is shot. And every 4 hours, one of America's children takes his or her own life. We have a 50% increase in the number of children living in poverty at a time when the stock market is raging high, when we've created more wealth than ever in our history. And we've seen almost a quarter of our nation's children as a whole living in poverty. Now, how can this be? We are running a farm system for those jails. And all you have to do is look at many of the inner cities and some rural areas, and you'll find children who are so at risk that increasingly they are without a parent at home, without a structure for after school, without any of the wonderful efforts that have been created by communities, whether it's through Boys Club, Girls Club, Big Brother, Big Sister, YMCA, YWCA, City Year, Youth Build, all of these efforts that are the only interventions in their lives that make a difference. They are absent the three great teachers of life. Family, number one. Teachers, school, because they're not in school, number two. And organized religion, number three. What they have are coping skills that they gain from the streets. But no one here, I would assert, would accept that those are sufficient values to be transmitting to our kids with hopes that they will be full citizens in a world that increasingly depends on the capacity of people to process information and have skills in order to share in the splendors of this new economy. Meanwhile, the greatest restraint on growth in our state and in most states in this country is the lack of available skilled labor pool. We just passed H-1B visas in the United States Senate so that we will invite 195,000 people who have been trained in other countries to come in and take the skilled jobs in America, even as we send these people to prison instead. Mostly, I might add, people of color, Hispanic, African American. Among African American males, in the 1980s, the percentage of those who aren't even measured in the unemployment rate because they're not in the labor force, the percentage was 16%. Today, my friends, it is 23%. 23% out in the streets, foraging, preying on other people, literally getting by. And then we wonder why we pay the price of $36 billion a year in lost productivity and lost capacity, not to mention the taxes that every American pays for chronic unemployment, drug treatment, housing people in the youth detention system, which incidentally is increasing, even as I say, we have created this enormous wealth. Now, I don't want to just drive these statistics at you, but I need to say that I have visited too many places, even in our own state of Massachusetts. The Castle Square Early Child Development Center on the border of Roxbury and Back Bay. 67 wonderful children left there in the morning, mostly by single parents, to safety, to nurturing, to love, and picked up in the evening by a parent working hard to make things work. But for the 67 kids that are in it, in our Boston, in our Athens of America, in our great rich state, for the 67 kids who are in it, there are 500 on a waiting list. And I tell you, barely any of those 500 will cross the threshold of that center ever before they are supposed to, under our law, matriculate in the first grade, ready for school. Doesn't happen. And then we have teachers with 25, 30 kids in a classroom, with kids who come in who literally can't recognize colors, can't do early numbers, don't have the basic functioning capacities of most kids from what we've learned from early child development, what they could have if they had that kind of care and nurturing at the earliest stage. And so teachers have to try to make it up in classrooms where it's impossible, and parents get frustrated, and people run away from the public school, and yet in Washington, there's a desultory, if almost non-existent debate with respect to what we really need to do to bolster up the place where 90% of America's children go to school, the public school system of this country. I don't care how many vouchers you have or how many charter schools you start. There simply aren't enough places to put them, and you can't do it fast enough to save a generation and prepare them for the kind of citizenship that all of us want as we go down the road. Now, I could go on into education. I just want to juxtapose that to one other quick sector of the brokenness of our government, and then I'll tell you what I think we have to do. The entire foreign relations area that Jeffrey is so invested in and so many of you care about, we are also moving backwards. We've had the budget in 1986 under Ronald Reagan for all of our foreign affairs, for all of our investments in international development, in the UN agencies, and all of our, every single international environmental effort, drug enforcement, you name it, was $36 billion. Today, it is about $21 billion. We've actually had almost a 50% reduction even as the world is globalized, technologicalized, and as we have emerged with the demise of the Soviet Union as the sole superpower on the face of this planet with enormous global responsibilities, and we are walking away from them with a Congress that almost half the members don't have a passport and go home and brag that they don't travel abroad and don't need to deal with those issues. So why are we so stuck? Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I'll tell you, after all the years that I've been part of this process, and the reason I mentioned the money earlier is that we are essentially the prisoners in our own nation of a financing system that, if it doesn't guarantee that people get their way, at least guarantees that nothing positive can happen quickly enough to make it positive. So it is a member of the Banking Committee, I will tell you. It took us 3 or 4 years to pass something as simple as interstate banking, which was long overdue. It took us 3 or 4 tries to pass financial modernization. Notwithstanding that the rest of the world was passing us by, the controller of the currency was making changes on his own administratively, and the Congress was sitting there twiddling its thumbs and floundering. You can go from issue to issue to issue where the amount of money in American politics is robbing Americans of their voices, and where, in fact, the agenda of this nation is being distorted. They put quotes around it, they spend $100 million a month in Washington, D.C. to get us to do something or to stop us from doing something. And I will tell you, that money has an enormous impact, particularly since every single member of the United States Congress is dependent on it in order to be able to run for election and get elected. Now, let me tell you about it. I was chairman of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee back in 1988. And in 1988, we spent $16 million is what I raised. It was a record back then. George Mitchell had preceded me. He raised $12 million. We thought we did pretty well, and I refused to take soft money. Let me tell you what happened in 1992. 16 million in 1988. 1992, Democrats raised 85 million in hard money, 30 million in soft money. Republicans, get this, raised 164 million to the Democrats' 85 and 45 million of soft. In 1996, Democrats raised 145 million in hard, 107 million in soft. Republicans raised 278 in hard and 120 in soft. And in 2000, Democrats actually raised more in soft money for the first time in history, 199 million to the 172 in hard money. And the Republicans raised 295 million in hard and 210 million in soft for more than $500 million. In total, all of the interests of the country, the parties, the special interests spent almost $3 billion on this election. And if anyone here can tell me that one of those 30-second ads was in fact informative and dispositive, I'll pay you $500,000. What happens in all of this? Well, what happens is the real dialogue gets drowned out. We don't even have presidential debates worthy of the name of a debate where candidates can't talk to each other, people can't ask questions, it's all contrived and trumped up, and in the end, it cheats the American people. So we have an enormous task ahead of us as the next President of the United States thinks about how to heal the wounds of this past election and fix the process. And what is very difficult for me as a Democrat to process is that Mr. Bush has adopted the position of his party, which you can understand why, because you see the imbalance in the amount of money they raise, which clearly has affected the outcome of the Senate, which makes even more remarkable what we achieved this year in winning 5 additional seats and having a 50-50 split in the United States Senate. But I want to just close by saying that there really is something more important in this process. And Marcy, your efforts in New Hampshire and all those who are part of the Young Democrats or Young Republicans, it doesn't matter to me which party you're part of. I'd rather have you be part of mine, but I want you to participate. Those of us who came into politics in the late 1960s probably made a lot of mistakes over the last 15, 20 years. And certainly there were some terrible excesses in that period of time that none of us would extol as virtues to our fellow citizens. But there was nevertheless something extraordinary in the sense of possibility, the sense that we each could make a difference and change the life around us. And indeed, if you measure it, we did. In the late 1960s, we did stop a war. We did tell a president of the United States, you can no longer serve as president. We did wind up creating a movement that created the EPA. There was no EPA before 1972. There was no Safe Drinking Water Act, no Clean Air Act, no Clean Water Act, no Housing Act, no Civil Rights Act, no Voting Rights Act, until people, mostly students, assumed responsibility for their country and went out and held the politicians accountable. That is the great virtue of our democracy and of the capacity of every individual to make that kind of difference. And somehow, folks, we have to recognize that power that so many people in so many other countries die to be able to exercise and do a better job of exercising it ourselves. Robert Kennedy, and I know for some people these words now are perhaps somewhat trite. I don't think they are. They're not to me anyway, and I hope they're not to you. But he, in 1968, really touched on what I think, and I hope you share with me, our politics ought to be about, which is a different measurement. And he said that, you know, he talked about how when we measure our politics in America, we measure the gross domestic product, and we do all these statistical measurements of it, and locks for police, and ambulances, and the nuclear bombs, and all of this. But he said what we don't measure as we take that stock is the quality of our kids' education, the health of our children, the joy of their play. He said we don't measure the strength of our marriages or the beauty of our poetry. We measure neither the intelligence of our public debate nor the integrity of our public officials, neither our wit nor our wisdom, neither our courage nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to country. And in the end, he said, we measure everything except that which makes life worth living. And it tells us everything about America, except why we're most proud of being Americans. I believe that that is precisely the kind of measurement of our politics that most of our fellow citizens, Democrat or Republican, Libertarian, Naderite, whatever, are thirsting for, is an honest appraisal of the issues before this nation, and hopefully a search for the common ground which empowers us all to make choices for our future that ennoble us as human beings and ultimately defines our nation. That's what this is really all about, and that's what I hope so many of you here will leave this great institution with a sense of purpose about. Thank you for the privilege of chatting with you. I apologize for going on so long, and I thought I should end on a more optimistic note, so let me just share with you that we should all be delighted that pregnant Chads does not mean a new White House scandal or Washington scandal. Feel good about things. Can I open it up to questions? I gather there are a series of mics. Why don't we begin over here?
Hi, my name is Danya Palanker. I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I want to thank you for coming, and I want to thank you for your comments on the situation of prisons in our country. I think it's very important to highlight those. I want to actually ask you a question about what's going to happen in Washington and the Senate with the 50-50 Senate. I was wondering, as someone there, what you think the hypothesis is, what's going to happen with leadership. I know there's some questions about whether there'll be a leadership for 3 weeks that'll change, and whether the vice president might end up having to make a decision, a tie-breaking vote.
Well, I can announce with certainty that I mean, unless, well, I guess under any circumstances, Tom Daschle is going to be majority leader for 17 days. Because Joe Lieberman won't resign until, if they're elected, until right before the 20th, I assume. And of course, Al Gore is vice president until the 20th, so he presides over the Senate. So we're at 51 until the 20th of January, which means we can do all kinds of mischief. But we have opted to heed my own words of a few moments ago and be statespeople. We don't want to do that. It would be obviously very disruptive. It would only spread poison. There's enough of that around already. So Tom, in his wisdom, has decided that we're really just going to try to work with the Republicans and see if we can't reach an accommodation as to how to divide the Senate. Now, if Al Gore is elected, we go from the 50 down to 49 because we lose Joe Lieberman's seat. So then there'll be a different ratio on the committees, and that's what we're really working out right now. If it's 50-50, we are asking for parity. Why? Because historically in the United States Senate, the committees are always divided according to the 100, not counting the tie-breaking vote cast by the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President of the United States. So we will have a 50-50 split, which means we want even chairmanships in a sense, sort of sharing the chairs. We may have a title that's a chair, but it may be that the powers will be shared, and even numbers on the committees. And some people think that's an invitation to even worse gridlock. Let me caution you. There are a lot of colleagues on both sides of the aisles who would express a lot of the frustration I expressed tonight. The Senate, thank God, is really a wonderful kind of microcosm of the country. They're people of diverse walks of life, diverse capacities and concerns who really want to get some things done, I think. And it's often a reflection of the leadership as much as it is some of the other sort of political issues that hover around. So I think if we exert good leadership and if we look for that common ground, the Senate may be able to be a far more productive place than it has been in the last few years. And our hope is that we can work to find that critical center, if you will. There are good people on the other side of the aisle who I've come to respect and like and work with. And I think if we can really work at it, we may be able to make progress on education, on Social Security, Medicare, prescription drugs. I mean, a lot of those key issues that people really want to see us act on. So, again, we have to wait and see what happens in this race. Now, I have to tell you, if the Florida legislature just flexes its muscles in an untoward fashion and tries to insert itself inappropriately in this process, depending on what the Supreme Court does or doesn't do, that could really poison the national well in what might even be deemed an almost dangerous way. And so my prayer is that they will not be so intemperate as to do that. And I think that if the Supreme Court, as I suspect it will, has a unanimous decision, no matter what it is, but particularly if it were to be affirming the Florida court, I would be surprised if the legislature tries to buck the Supreme Court under those circumstances. And I'm not sure the country would stand for that, particularly since Jeb Bush, the president's brother, erstwhile president's brother, would have to sign that legislation into law. That gets pretty tricky. Yes?
Senator Kerry, I'd first like to thank you very much for coming to the forum. Everyone here really appreciates it. My name is Ganesh Sitaraman. I'm a freshman at Harvard College. In the event that Vice President Gore does not win the election, who do you see in the Democratic field of candidates in 2004, and would you see yourself in that field?
I don't know what you're clapping for. If that's a sign that you think that we want to start the 2004 race tonight, I'm not with you, folks. Look, let's finish this race before we start the next one, and we'll see what develops. You know, by the way, I'm up for re-election in 2002, and I would appreciate your support. So, and we'll see what happens after that. Yes. Sure.
Hi, my name is Choi. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. In one of our classes, we had Tom Finneran, the Speaker of the House of Massachusetts, as a guest lecturer, and he said he was dead set against campaign finance reform because in the absence of this enforceability, the reform could, corrupt the system even more. And he said he's an average Joe, and he doesn't have money to run the campaign, and he needed the people's donation or contributions to run the campaign. And he's a Democrat, and I'm just wondering, even within your own party, there's a big difference of opinion on this campaign finance reform. I'm just wondering, what is your take on that?
Well, that's a great question, and I really appreciate it. First of all, there's not as much difference in our party as you might think. We've had a high watermark of about 46, 47 votes for a public financing component of a campaign finance reform bill, and we passed. We did pass campaign finance reform, and George Bush Sr. vetoed it. So we've actually been down this road for some number of years. Senator George Mitchell, David Boren, and I wrote a piece of legislation. David was there. We were working on it. Which was the precursor to McCain-Feingold. In fact, McCain-Feingold was almost word for word our bill, except that they threw in some public broadcasting free time, which has since dropped by the wayside because it's just very difficult to implement. It doesn't work easily. Now, here's my take on what Tom Finneran is saying. In the state, we have a campaign finance reform regimen under which all the state folks have to live. I think for governor, it's a $500 maximum contribution and annually, and there's a public finance component. There's a fund that's put together, and you agree to live by those standards, and so you get the public finance money, but you have a limit as to what you can spend totally. Now, what Tom is saying, and I happen to agree with him, the limits have been set at a level that aren't realistic in terms of your capacity to adequately fund a legitimate campaign, to be able to buy the media, do all the things you need to do in terms of reaching voters on the ground. And so, in fact, as sometimes happen, you have unintended consequences of a good concept. And the unintended consequences of campaign finance reform. In fact, 1974 was the seminal year of the passage of campaign finance reform in the country, which we now live under. $1,000 limit, primary, $1,000 limit, general election. That was in response to the Watergate crisis. And so in came Common Cause and others appropriately, and we passed campaign finance reform, but we haven't changed that amount of money since then. And yet there's been a trebling or quadrupling of the costs of campaigning. So we spend an inordinate amount of time. My last race cost me $13, $14 million, and as I said, I don't take PAC money, I didn't take soft money. The maximum contribution to me was $1,000 once every 6 years, twice, because primary and general. And I have to go all over the country as I do. I had a fundraiser in New York City last night, raising money for re-election. We spend an inordinate amount of time doing that. I think Tom Finneran would gladly give up the risk to his reputation of having to go to companies and people and ask them for money in order to have a fair system that allowed him to adequately address the people of the state and run for office. And that's what we have to find, is that fair medium where you can carry your message out. Now, this may surprise you. I don't believe that campaign finance reform means that you can have a pure public funding system, because there's nothing that weeds out in that. There's nothing that sort of establishes any baseline credibility of a candidacy. And I think it is legitimate for somebody who says, I want to be a United States congressman, or I want to be a senator, to have some kind of threshold base that they go to for a fair amount of threshold sort of qualifying money, if you will, the ante. And at that point, you agree to live under a limit, and the federal funding or the state funding kicks in, and you have a partial funding mechanism. That's precisely what we passed a number of years ago, and I think it's the only way ultimately to have a system that's going to work. And unfortunately, we probably can't apply it across the board to all the primaries. It would have to be in the general election or something like the presidential race. But we can end any soft money at all being part of this process, and that is the first most important step to restoring integrity to the system. Yes?
Maybe we could go up to the people up there.
Sure.
2 microphones. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tony Vila, freshman.
Go ahead. I'll go to both of you. We'll go here, and then we'll go over there.
I'm Tony Vila, freshman at the college. In this last election, it's pretty much safe to say that Al Gore lost because Nader voters didn't vote for Gore. And in general, the Democratic Party in the past 4 years has shown a big problem in the more far-left base and the centrist base. And as both parties really rush to the center to get more money and to appeal to more voters, the centrists become more pragmatic and not really listening to their ideals, whereas in reaction, the far left and the far right become less pragmatic and not willing to compromise and willing to shoot down their own party, even in cases where it will hurt them a great deal, such as Nader with the Gore 90,000 votes that didn't go to Gore. And with things like the WTO and recently the China trade bill, there is obviously a big cleavage between these two groups, the centrists and the far left and right. What is the Democratic Party trying to do to fix this? There's the widespread contempt for the DLC and the widespread contempt on the other side for Nader and his followers.
Well, that's a very astute question that raises, some major issues. But, there's an old saying, politics ain't beanbag. It's a tough business. It's a very tough business. The tensions, the pulls of sort of managing in a diverse, pluralistic country, in a democracy like ours, the effort to try to create consensus about an issue, particularly now with the diversity of media that we have, is exceedingly difficult. Now, I'm not giving any excuses for it. I just want to describe the playing field. When David and I were sort of first active a number of years ago, you had CBS, NBC, ABC, and public television. And a president who was talking to the country could get a block and talk to the nation. Today, that's absolutely impossible. Titanic beats, reruns beat whatever is going on in terms of the public dialogue. And NBC refused even to carry some of the presidential debates, which is, I'll tell you, as a member of the Commerce Committee, I can't wait to have some hearings on that one as we go down the road. But coming back to your question, so how do we resolve this? Part of the art of politics is building a coalition that appeals to a majority point of view, that creates a majority point of view if it isn't already there. And what I'm trying to argue to you is that I think there's a different path for our party to some degree. I have great respect for a lot of what Ralph Nader was saying. He was correct about a lot. But I don't agree with him that it was a twiddly-dum, twiddly-dee choice and it didn't matter if you voted for him. I just don't agree with that. And I think it was disingenuous of him to suggest that to people. The Supreme Court of the United States matters. For women who care about the issue of choice, if George Bush is president, we're going to have a very tough time in that Judiciary Committee. And it matters to us. It matters to me who has a veto pen on a particular piece of legislation that seeks to change wetlands law or that prohibits us from even evaluating I don't know if you know this. We are prohibited from even evaluating in the EPA what the effects of raising the CAFE standards would be on the air quality of our country. Not even allowed to evaluate it. You know when that got in there, folks? 1995, when Newt Gingrich and those folks came to the Congress and they slid it in there for one of those special interests that was servicing them through the campaign process, and they got it in. So how do you build a coalition that weaves its way through this? I think we need to sort of talk more just plain common sense and truth about some of these issues. Globalization and technology are inevitable. I know some people have, as you said, and it's not a great word. It doesn't help us sort of build bridges to use the word contempt for somebody else's political point of view, which may be perfectly legitimate. The fact is there are enormous tensions in some of these issues brought on by globalization. But I'll tell you something about globalization. Those of us who don't like child labor laws, or those of us who think people should have a right to strike in another country, or those of us who think that we ought to have environmental concerns at the forefront of our concern, in all of our developmental policies, World Bank, IMF, in all of our trade agreements, et cetera, have to acknowledge that globalization and the drive of technology is going to happen no matter how powerful the will of any politician to the contrary. No politician, no person can stop it. You can be like Ted Kaczynski and hate it, and you can find plenty of ways to vilify it, but our charge, your charge, my charge in life is to try to tame the most inimical forces that are brought on by it. And that's the dialogue that we now have to have in our party. Is how do we change the discussion in the World Trade Organization to begin to get them to embrace these other concerns as we go down the road. Now, I will tell you that I think we're making progress. I take part each year, as do others here that I notice in the audience, in something called the World Economic Forum. It's a gathering in Davos, Switzerland, of some people that people love to vilify. But the fact is that over the last years, the Seattle demonstration, the IMF demonstrations in Washington, in Europe, have had a major impact. And now, the people who are on the outside are in fact being invited in. And people are searching for new ways to try to say, we can't afford to have a backlash grow so strong that all of the gains we've made in many countries through these transitions of the last 10 or 15 years are lost to that backlash. And I think there's a middle ground there that can change yours and other people's contempt into a more healthy kind of dialogue that ultimately winds up turning into policy that's more progressive and sensitive and internationally palatable. And that would be my desire, obviously, and I hope we can do that. But we got to talk to each other. We can't just sort of vilify each other and drive everybody off into the extremes. You'd be amazed how sometimes when you get into a room with someone who you think is your worst enemy, you can actually find some real common ground, and that's the art of legislating, and David will tell you that. You know, I've sat with Jesse Helms on many occasions, though we are diametrically opposed on a number of issues, and had the most courtly, gentlemanly, decent discussions and found common ground. To give you an example, I introduced the major AIDS legislation this past year with Bill Frist of Tennessee. And he and I together went to Jesse Helms. And we honestly didn't think we'd get very far. And we sat with him and he said, you know, this is really a serious problem. And we got to find some way to deal with it. And lo and behold, Jesse Helms became a co-sponsor with us as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, helped us move this legislation, and now we have a $500 million fund that is going to help put vaccine creation at the forefront for malaria, for tuberculosis, infectious tuberculosis, and HIV. And we're going to have a major tax credit to help corporations that haven't wanted to do it be drawn into creating the vaccine so we can help deal with the problem in Africa of 11 million orphans. That'll be 40 million orphans by the year 2010. Those are the constructive ways that I encourage you to think about politics. And yes, you ought to keep pressuring, and yes, you need to demonstrate, and yes, you need to march, but think of it in terms of creating a dialogue, not the extinction of the other side, if you would. Yeah.
My name is Felicity Spector. I'm at the Center of Public Leadership at the Kennedy School. And I want to ask really whether you're an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to viewing what's going to happen in the next Congress. Everyone who's giving two penneth of advice to the next president says they've got to be bipartisan, they've got to include people from the other party in their cabinet, they're going to have to build coalitions. But are there, for example, Democrats who would want to serve on a George Bush cabinet? Why would they want to do that? Is there a Senate who would want to help the guy along who they feel cheated about the election? Is there a Senate who would want to help the guy who they believe cheated their person out of the election? I mean, is it going to be deadlock, or are we living in a nice world and it's all going to be bipartisan?
That is precisely why this legitimacy issue is so important. That's a simple answer to you. I think that the quality of service that may be expected from people from the opposite party, no matter who it is, will depend on the legitimacy of this process in the next days. And that's why this is such high stakes for all of us. And until we see how that plays out, it's going to be very difficult to answer your question. A lot of people in both parties, in the current mood, would refuse to serve. And it's a very difficult situation, which we obviously need to try to work through. But it's a good question, and there's no easy way. Am I an optimist? The answer is yes, I'm an optimist. It's like that famous story, the psychiatrist who had two kids. You know that story? One of them was a pessimist and was always crying about. They shut him in a room and they checked the pessimist, and the pessimist was crying away even though they were surrounded with toys, because they always thought somebody was come in, break the toy or steal the toy, so they were crying and crying. The other kid was in a room with a pile of manure, and the kid's throwing the manure around and clapping and cheering and saying, God, this is great. And the person comes in, how can you be so happy? He says, well, I know there's a pony down there somewhere. So I'm an optimist. There's a pony down there somewhere, yeah.
Senator Kerry, my name's Alan Wright. The Massachusetts Port Authority has proposed building a new runway at Logan Airport. Their proposal is being faced with substantial citizen and political opposition. This is an issue that is not only local but national, as the fight is taking place in many cities across this country. Will you, and have you taken a position on Massport's proposal?
No. Will I? Yes. Have I? No. But let me just tell you my thinking about it and give you a sense of it. First of all, I serve on the Commerce Committee, and I'm on the Transportation Subcommittee, which is involved with rail. I am a passionate advocate of rail and of transit systems. And I am was working with Frank Lautenberg and Pat Moynihan, who were the two most brilliant sort of advocates we had in the Senate on this subject. And now they're gone, and we're going to have to pick up a fight with some people, unfortunately, in the Senate who want to zero out Amtrak, who don't believe in it. But I think it's a disgrace that this nation does not have a first-rate, high-speed rail system, at least on its two coasts that goes north and south, and we ought to have more. And I've been a strong advocate of the electrification of the train from New York to here, cutting it down to below 3 hours, et cetera, which would significantly unclog Logan Airport and LaGuardia and the Washington slots, and we could do a lot better. This is feasible, and a nation like ours ought to really set up those kinds of projects. I mean, it's not unlike what John Kennedy tried to do in going to the moon, only it's here at home, but it's a little more practical now. We have major deferred requirements for infrastructure across the country. A lot of our cities, sewer systems, water treatment. We haven't had a major water treatment investment program since the 1970s. And so we really are going to have to think very hard about the long-term infrastructure needs of the country, and part of it is in transportation. Now, that said, airlines are going to continue to be a critical component of our growth capacity in the country. We need to, however, look more carefully at the regional solution to it. That runway, which we might in the long term need a runway. I don't know the answer to that yet, and that's the analysis we're doing, and I leave that open. But even if we need that runway, that's not a solution to the overall regional transportation problems that we face. And we're going to have to look at connecting with green down in Rhode Island, again, the high-speed rail possibilities, Westover Air Force Base, which is grossly underutilized in every regard and would offer certain kinds of options. But in my judgment, we would significantly minimize the social conflict of that choice if we were to invest more significantly in the East Coast corridor for high-speed rail, which I think is a better solution. But until we have a regional input, Teddy Kennedy and I are both working at trying to get a regional input on that before we make a decision as to exactly what the plus or minus is. And we'll have to see where that comes out.
Thank you.
We're a little bit over the scheduled end, but if we could ask maybe one more question?
Yeah.
Please.
My name's Mike Jung, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I'd like to commend you first on your dedication to environmental issues. Overshadowed by the political impasse in our own country was the political impasse at The Hague in the climate change negotiations. I'd like to ask you what opportunities, if any, you see remaining for the incoming administration on this particular issue.
Boy, I love that question, and thank you for asking it, because I've been deeply involved in the global climate change issue since the beginning. Al Gore and I used to sit beside each other on the Commerce Committee, and we were part of those early hearings, and I have been to every single climate conference globally. I was in Rio, I was in Buenos Aires, I was in Kyoto, and now in The Hague. And my staff was in Berlin and also has worked significantly at these. So I feel very invested in it. And I was the floor manager of the amendment, the Byrd-Hagel amendment on our side of the fence when it came to the floor as part of the Kyoto Treaty. And here's my take on it. In the time I was in The Hague, I thought we'd get a deal, but I understand why we didn't. And we have to really shoulder enormous responsibility in this country for our lack of genuine effort ever since Rio, where we made a, albeit voluntary, commitment to cut our emissions to 1990 levels. We are now in the year 2000, which is the year we should have met our goal of cutting those emissions to the 1990 levels, and we're 13% above them. By the year 2012, by the year 2012, I guess, which was the outside year for the budget period that we were negotiating in The Hague, we will have an increase of some 28% above where we are supposed to be at our continued rate of emissions. We are the world's greatest polluter, emitting 24% of all the world's greenhouse gases. But, and here's the complication, the forces in opposition to the treaty, which are obvious: coal, fuel oil, all your fossil fuel providers, automobile industry, all of the folks who have a stake in the gases themselves, have done an extraordinarily effective job of advertising and distorting the Kyoto Treaty in effect, but also, and the issue itself, challenging the science, hiring and creating false analyses to be promulgated as supposedly legitimate studies that debunk the science and so forth. But a couple of things are happening. First of all, the effects of global climate change are taking hold in ways that only the most obdurate Luddite could conceivably avoid. And it seems to me that that was evidenced this year because Larry Craig and Chuck Hagel came to The Hague and together said that they now accept the fundamentals of the science. So the question is, what will we do about it now that they've accepted the fundamentals of the science? And the tension that grew in The Hague was a direct result of the European anger at our low gas prices and their high gas prices, and the fact that the United States has made no bona fide effort to try to really reduce the real gases, but wanted to try to look to what's called sequestration, the sinks, the forests and the photosynthesis process to chew up the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. And so they perceived us as trying to rely on the natural growth
the sort of things that we do anyway, the business as usual, rather than fighting to make real reductions in emissions. And they're right to that degree. There was too much of a business as usual position in the opening gambit of our negotiators there, and I told them that, and publicly said I thought they had to scale that back. Now, they did. They went from some 300 million metric tons that they wanted in sequestration down to about 55 million metric tons, and would have probably moved a little further, except that the European community, driven as it is by some very hardline, uncompromising groups, put in front of us a proposal that was simply unacceptable in terms of both compliance and other components here. So in the final hours, I want to say this carefully, I think there are circumstances under which we might have still gotten it, but I think patience had worn thin. There was no one person there who was able to kind of drive it in its final moments. Exhaustion set in, and so it failed. But I believe that we will come back quickly. There's a plan to meet in May, I think, in Bonn, and then there's the next meeting of the formal conference of the parties in Marrakesh. I think it's June or July, Maurice, whichever it is, yeah. So we will get together then. Incidentally, we're in the presence. Maurice Strong was one of the most powerful movers and shakers in getting the original agreement and in helping us through Rio and so forth. And we're in the presence of one of the real forces in all of this effort. The United States has got to take measures. Now, the DOE has come out with a wonderful and legitimate analysis of enormous gains that we could make in this country in very easy ways. And while I was in The Hague, I had dinner with Sir Charles Nicholson, who is one of the top people in British Petroleum. And British Petroleum has, of its own accord, announced that they are going to reduce emissions by 10 or 15%, I forget which, 10% over the course, well, you know more than I do, over the course of the next years. And he told me that he has been amazed, all of them in the company have been amazed by the ease with which they are ahead of the schedule that they've set at lower cost than they thought it would be, which is precisely the experience that we've had in this country when we did the Clean Air Act, the acid rain provisions, and reduced the SO2, which we did the trading mechanism, where we trade emissions between states. And that has allowed us to actually reduce emissions faster and much cheaper. That trading mechanism is what we're trying to implement on an international level between the developed countries. And regrettably, again, the Europeans don't trust the trading mechanism. It's somewhat inimical, frankly, to some of the ways they, their economies work, which incidentally underscores that they're also not as efficient as ours in many ways and haven't done as well in the last few years. So there's a lot of tension. I think ultimately there will be just such a compelling increase in the incidences of flooding, of drought, of transition in crops, of conflict as a result of this, ice melt, the polar ice caps. All of these things are simply growing, and people can't avoid the realities of this much longer. So I think we will come back, we will ultimately get some agreement. Now here, I know it's a long answer, but the final rub is this. The United States Senate has voted in the Byrd-Hagel Amendment that we will not sign on or implement any of the provisions of this treaty until the less developed countries sign on. I understand that, very sympathetic to it, because the less developed countries represent 36.6% of the world's emissions. And no matter what we do, we can't do it unless they're also part of the process. So why won't they sign on? Because in Berlin, an agreement was made that we would go first, and they see us emitting so much that unless we do it, they think it's just a conspiracy to hold them down and not allow them to develop the way we have. So it's a Gaston, Alphonse and Gaston standoff where nobody's going to move until the other moves. I think it's incumbent on us to move. And I think the leadership of this country ought to demonstrate to the rest of the world, particularly since in the last 3 years, China, which is 13% all by itself, China actually went down in emissions, even as the United States of America went up. And the fact is that the less developed world is doing switching of fuels to unleaded gas. They're engaging in all kinds of state-of-the-art technology. It's not as if they're ignoring the problem. A deal is a deal, and the United States better keep it, or we're going to be the inviter of even greater sense of disrepute on a global basis. And by the way, at the same time, we ought to stand up and pay our dues to the United Nations and peacekeeping and do the things that are necessary. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.